So here's the deal with logical reasoning. I mentioned earlier that the one thing they're testing on the test is your ability to deduce what must be true given what was said. That is also true in logical reasoning. There are 15 different question types, 18 different question types if you want to read a different book, 21 different question types if you want to read another book. There are a lot of different ways of breaking these questions down. But what's true about every single one of them is that you are given some information in the passage, and you are either asked to accept everything in that passage as true, or some of the claims in that passage as true. Okay? Big picture, we'll just step back here and look at the big picture. Logical reasoning, by the way, if you're not familiar, is the one where they give you the short passage, they give you a question, and they give you 5 answers, right? That passage is either going to be a set of facts or it's going to be an argument, okay? If it's a set of facts, in almost all cases, not all cases, but in almost all cases, they will just ask you to accept those facts as true. The way they do that is they say, if the statements above are true, which one of the following is most strongly supported by them, or which one of the following must be true, or something like that, right? But the point is they ask you to accept those facts as true. So just like the games, you're accepting the rules of the game as true, and then you're trying to figure out what must be true on the basis of that. Sound good? But instead of like games, they're just sentences with words. Okay. Arguments, on the other hand, are... Does anyone know what an argument is? Can anyone give me a concise, accurate definition of an argument? Yes, go for it, Thomas.
Premise and a conclusion?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. An argument has to contain at least one premise and at least one conclusion. A premise is what? Anyone? The explanation. The evidence. I like that better. So, an argument is going to have at least one premise and then at least one conclusion, and the premise is equal to evidence. Now, they won't say this explicitly, but what you're required to do is accept the premises as true. Any evidence that they give you on the LSAT, you have to accept it as true no matter how much you disagree with it. The world is not getting warmer. Therefore, chill out. Right? That could be an argument. Not getting warmer, therefore, chill out. Right? So on the LSAT, you'd have to accept the claim that the world is not getting warmer because that's being presented as evidence for my conclusion that you should chill out, right? A lot of us would read that and say, BS, right? No, I think the world is getting warmer. I'm pretty sure I read it like 100 times in the last 10 years. But that doesn't matter because on the LSAT, we just accept the evidence as true. The real question on the test is, does the conclusion have to follow from that evidence, right? It's the same thing over and over again. We're going to give you some shit, and you have to tell me what must be true from that shit. Now, I'm sorry to swear, but this is kind of shitty, right? Like, it's not true, but it doesn't matter. The games are shitty, right? We're ordering decks, and G has to be immediately before K? And it can't go in the 6th week? Like, who came up with these stupid rules, right? It's actually kind of like regulations, maybe. So, maybe we're all just messed up. But in any case, you have to accept this and you say, okay, well, even if it's true that the world is not getting warmer, does that mean that I should chill out? No, there could be plenty of other things that I should not be chilling out about. Right? I was just in New York this weekend, and there was a guy standing in the street with a sign of like mutilated chickens and a speaker making chicken noises. He's like trying to say, hey, look, your chickens are not being sourced properly. The funny thing was, there was a lot of police officers, and the police officer told this man that he had to keep walking because you weren't allowed to protest in this fashion, right? You have to keep walking, can't be stationary. And there's all this other, weird stuff going on. People are naked, and whatever. That's New York City, but I thought it was interesting. That was the one guy that had to be, confronted and addressed. We're going to address this problem The guy with the speaker and his mutilated chickens. But anyways, if this is true, this does not necessarily have to be true. In other words, it's something that doesn't necessarily follow. It's not something that must be true. And whenever you notice that, whenever you see that the conclusion is not something that has to be true given what was said, you need to jump all over that. That's your job. If the conclusion is something that must be true, then the question is going to be testing something else. It's going to be asking you, what's the main conclusion of the argument, or what's the role of the second sentence, or something like that, right? But 70% of logical reasoning questions are flawed arguments, and by flawed, we just mean that the premises do not prove the conclusion. In other words, the conclusion is not something that must be true given the premises that were provided, even if it's something that's very likely to be true. Yeah?
So in one book, I read that you have to assume that every argument has something wrong with it. You're saying 70%.
Yeah, well, so let's clarify those numbers. I would say 80% of the questions are arguments, 20% are just facts. Of the 80% that are arguments, the vast majority of them are flawed, but some are definitely not. They said every argument is flawed?
They said like just go in assuming like that everything, like
What
try
book
to
was
find what's
this?
wrong. What's that trainer?
Okay. Go in with the assumption that it's flawed.
Like go in trying to figure out what's wrong.
It's probably going to be flawed, but I do want to read the argument and decide for myself whether I think the premises prove the conclusion. Because sometimes this is what happens. I read the argument, I'm like, you know what? Even though I don't like these premises, if I accept them as true, I do have to accept this conclusion. Okay, moving on. Now, the question's probably going to ask me, what's the role of this, or what's the main conclusion, or what's a parallel argument that's similar to this one? And then what happens is if it says, which one of the following, if true, most strengthens the argument, and I just said that the argument was valid, I know that I haven't read the argument well enough. I need to go back and figure out why the premises don't prove the conclusion, because you can't strengthen an argument that's perfect. So it can be a good indication to yourself of how well you've understood the argument if you decide on your own terms whether you think the conclusion is proven or not. Sound good? So, bottom line, I'm telling you all this stuff because although we want to talk about different question types, strengthened questions, sufficient assumption questions, weakened questions, parallel reasoning questions, role questions, all these different types of questions, the one skill you really need to develop is you read the passage. You decide for yourself, am I just looking at a bunch of facts or am I looking at an argument? If you're looking at an argument, you should be able to identify the premises and the conclusion and then decide for yourself, do you think that conclusion is proven? I'm not asking you whether that conclusion is supported. A lot of these conclusions are supported. Your job is to decide whether or not they're proven. And if they're not proven, your job is to then say why it's not necessarily true, even if it's very likely to be true. Because when you can identify why the conclusion is not necessarily true, you have almost always put yourself right into the correct answer. Because the correct answer is going to play off of that problem in some way, shape, or form. Right? If it's a necessary assumption question, you'll be like, wait, this argument's assuming X, Y, Z, and one of the answers will be X. Right? Or if it's a sufficient assumption question, the answer may be Y. If it's a strengthened question, it's going to fix that problem. If it's a weakened question, it's going to exploit that problem and make it worse. So your ability to decide whether it's an argument and whether it's valid, in other words, whether the premises prove the conclusion, is what this all comes down to. We can talk about all this other stuff, and it can be distracting if you don't get that core skill developed. Once you get that core skill developed, then we want to talk about the details. All right? Sound good? Questions? Okay.